Hello everyone, it's Miss Smith again, ready to discuss Isabella or the Pot of Basil. Last lesson I left you making notes on the poem up to stanza 41 and how Keats was blending elements of romance and Gothic genre. So if you haven't done that already, I would stop the video now and do that to finish off last lesson, please. Okay, if you are ready to start, we're going to begin by looking at some quotations taken from the middle section of the poem, the section that we've been looking at this week. And your task is to see if you can guess the missing words from each quotation. So, and have a little think about what the significance of each word that's being blocked out is. When you see each quotation, pause the video, have a think about it, write the quotation down and add your missing word in. And then when you start the video again, I'll immediately reveal the missing word, have a bit of a chat about it, and then we'll move on. So each time you see a new quotation, stop it, write it down, think about your missing word. So we've got 7 quotations that we're going to look at. And also, as you're thinking about the significance of the missing words that I've chosen, have a think about if you can see if there are any patterns emerging. Okay, so here's your first quotation. Here's something in the dust. Here's something in the dusk she seemed to see, and to the something made a gentle moan. So pause the video here, copy your quotation down and see if you can guess the word correctly. Okay, so here's the answer. So if you're not ready for the answers, pause again. So the answer is, his image in the dusk she seemed to see, and to the silence made a gentle moan. So this is taken from stanza 30, which, as I said to you yesterday, is the next time we sort of see Lorenzo, although it's not clear at this point whether she actually does see him, if she's dreaming, if she's talking about wanting to see him, whether or not it's real. So this is the kind of beginning of a vision coming on, and the beginning of her interacting with him in that way. So in this part of the poem we hear that Isabella is constantly seeking Lorenzo, and she's suffering in his absence. So she's searching for him, she's asking her brothers where he is, they tell her lies about where he is, and there's just this huge void and she can't fill it, and she's just suffering again. And it kind of echoes the suffering that both Isabella and Lorenzo went through at the beginning of the poem, but it was a more pleasurable suffering because they were suffering because they hadn't seen each other, or they couldn't be together during the day, and then obviously they were reunited in the evening time. But this is a prolonged suffering, and it's a suffering without any answers or without satisfactory answers, and she questions her brothers again and again. Okay, so our 2 words here, image and silence. So if you got it right, well done. If not, correct them and have a think about their further significance. Okay, so if you're ready for the next quotation. And every night in dreams they something aloud, to see their sister in her something shroud. Okay, so pause again while you copy it down and guess your words. Come back to me when you're ready. Okay, so our missing words this time. And every night in dreams they groaned aloud, to see their sister in her snowy shroud. So well done if you got those right. So the missing words this time, groaned and snowy. So this quotation's taken from stanza 33 and is revealing the brothers' response to Isabella's questions. It's an interesting stanza because it reminds us of earlier on in the poem when the brothers were observing Isabella and Lorenzo's love blossoming, and they were coming up with their terrible plan. So again, in an echo of what happened earlier on in the poem, here they continue to watch her. Their watching this time is again unsatisfactory. They don't like what they see. Keats is emphasising her innocence through the description of her snowy shroud, and he foreshadows her death with the reference to the shroud. The other thing that you might think about here is the reason why they are groaning. To me, is not particularly because they feel any sympathy for her. If they had any kind of empathy or sympathy for her, they wouldn't have killed the man she loves. But they're groaning, in my mind, because they can't fulfill their plan. They plan to marry her off, don't they, to somebody really wealthy, someone high status, someone who they see as befitting of their family connections, and someone who they think is going to enhance their business propositions. So they don't want to see her in a snowy shroud. They want to see her in wedding clothes, and they want to say fulfill that part of the plan. So their groaning is most unsatisfactory. Okay. So moving on to the next one. It was a something in the drowsy gloom, the dull of something at her couch's foot. Okay, so again, pause it, copy it down, add your words. Okay, so now we've got, it was a vision in the drowsy gloom, the dull of midnight at her couch's foot. Okay, so some brilliant language and imagery in all of these quotations, but I really like the dull of midnight, which is an interesting juxtaposition really, because what Keats is about to describe is not really dull or muted in any sense. Thinking about that a bit more as I'm talking. Okay, so we've got vision and midnight from stanza 35 here. So we've heard up until this point about how she's worrying about Lorenzo, she's pining for him, she looks for him everywhere, but he doesn't come to her. We're told Lorenzo does not come. And Keats is using that delaying tactic that he's used a few times in the poem. He's withholding things, he's making us wait, and he delays the vision of Lorenzo further until line 274, when he appears, as is timely for a ghost or a vision, at midnight. And it's also important to note here that Lorenzo, this vision, this ghost of Lorenzo, seems to appear within a dream. And we've seen dreams, haven't we, before in Keats's poetry, in the Eve of St Agnes and hinted at in La Belle Dame. So romantic poets like Keats were very interested in the idea of dreams and dreaming, possibly because of the suggestion that dreams were a kind of manifestation of the imagination at rest, and what the imagination can conjure in that state, that kind of spontaneous overflowing of feeling, and perhaps Keats associates that with beauty, and we know that Keats associates beauty with truth, so that perhaps this idea that there's a truth in dreams, and that this vision of Lorenzo will provide some sense of truth. So lots of interesting things to think about there. So Keats then goes on to describe the appearance of Lorenzo in a very pitiful way. He's weeping. Keats draws attention to his ruined hair. Hair becomes an important image in this part of the poem that you can have a think about. He has a forlorn voice, and he's described as crying. He does, I don't know about you, he does remind me a little bit of Banquo's ghost in the way that he's described as appearing. You know that when Banquo appears at the banquet, his hair's dishevelled, he has blood and gouts of blood in his hair. It's a really kind of disturbing image, and the attention that Keats pays to Lorenzo's hair here does put me in the mind of Shakespeare's description of Banquo. It's interesting how both Banquo and Lorenzo appear as they are now. Lorenzo doesn't appear to Isabella the ghost of what he once was. It's not a sanitised version of the young man that he was when in life. He is appearing to her as he is now. Keats talks about the soil or the clay in his ears and on his face and in his hair and all of those kinds of things, which is kind of increasing the pity and about the state of him, the condition of him, and these things that have been done to him. And it is appropriate because in stanza 40, Lorenzo says, and I think this is a really powerful line, I really like it, very beginning of stanza 40, Lorenzo says, "I know what was, I feel full well what is," and he appears to Isabella what he is at this point, which creates further pity for him and Isabella, and it really kind of forces home for the reader how utterly changed everything is for them. Okay, moving on to the next quotation, so same again. "Strange something it was when the pale shadow spake, for there was striving in its piteous something." Okay, so pause it, note it down, add your own words. Okay, so with this quotation, we're moving on from the missing words of vision and midnight in the last one. So this one, the missing words here are "strange sound it was when the pale shadow spake, for there was striving in its piteous tongue." So sound and tongue. So the quotation's coming from stanza 36 and describes Lorenzo's further efforts to transcend this boundary between life and death through speech. And Keats draws attention to what a huge effort it is for Lorenzo to speak, and pitifully forces us to reflect on how earlier in the poem it was each other's words and each other's voices that they longed to hear and that they drew such pleasure from. There's a real kind of echo once again, but in a changed way, of the beginning of the poem, and how their words and their voices were like music, beautiful music to each other. Okay, moving on again. Her eyes, though wild, were still a dewy bright with. And can you fill in the gaps or pause it and have a think? Okay, and this one is taken from stanza 37, and I'm just checking my anthology there because I've typed it incorrectly. It's not her eyes, it's its eyes. I beg your pardon. So its eyes, though wild, were all still dewy bright with love. Okay, so reminding us in this instance of that line from stanza 28 where the narrator suggested that there in the forest did his great love cease. So proving that false, really, that love is transcending the grave here, and that the love continues between the two. Okay, on to the next one. Thy something makes me glad. Okay, thy paleness makes me glad. Another really interesting quotation that might help us think a little bit further about the function of Lorenzo as a ghost, as we were talking about last lesson. What function does he serve? This is really useful in helping us think about that. So the missing word, which is taken from stanza 40, is paleness there. Why does Isabella's paleness make him glad? Sounds like quite a cruel thing to say, really, because paleness has connotations of illness, of suffering, of death, and she's pale because she's sick and pale with grief, yet he seems to take comfort from that. I've just realised as I've said that sick and pale with grief is a line from Romeo and Juliet, and actually this poem just reminds me of Romeo and Juliet quite a lot, and I'll ask you to look at that in a future lesson. But yeah, she's sick and pale with grief here because she's been separated from him. She doesn't know where he is, nobody's given her any answers. She wants to be with him and she can't. Yet here we have Lorenzo taking some comfort from that. So why does he take comfort from that? Well, is it because the idea that she's pale and that she's suffering confirms that she loves him, and that reassures him? Or is it just a plea for acknowledgement from Lorenzo? A lot of the language and the description in this part of the poem suggests that perhaps there's feelings of loneliness associated with Lorenzo and his current state. In the stanzas leading up to this one, he details the whereabouts of his grave and he implores her, "Go shed one tear upon my heather bloom, and it shall comfort me within the tomb." And at the end of stanza 39, he talks about how those sounds grow strange to me and thou art distant in humanity. So everything's moving away from him, the sounds of the real world are moving away from him, and he's kind of in this state of limbo, I guess, this faltering between two states, and is struggling to cope with that. And obviously there is the issue as well of the wrongdoing that's been done to him, and the fact that the two brothers go unpunished and continue to go unpunished at this point in the poem. Okay, moving on to your final quotation, I need to jot down and have a guess at. The spirit mourned something. Okay, what do you think that last word is? Okay, so this quotation is really interesting. I know I find everything really interesting. It's really interesting in relation to some of the other literary spirits that we were talking about last lesson. So the missing word is adieu, which means goodbye. And what's significant about that is also the final words of the ghost of Hamlet's father in Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, as he begs Hamlet to avenge his death. He says to him, "Adieu, adieu, remember me." And Hamlet repeats those words, and Hamlet does obviously remember his father, but he remembers his command to get revenge for him. I think this is surely a nod from Keats to Shakespeare's tragedy, and kind of reminding us of that tradition that he's writing in, and being kind of quite explicit that he is telling a story that falls into the genre of tragedy here. But perhaps it's also a suggestion that Lorenzo's ghost is a vengeful one. So again, making us think about the function, why he's appearing. Is it because he wants to get revenge? His revenge ultimately will be being reunited with Isabella, and the fact that their love continues in some form. So ultimately she does dig up his body, she cuts his head off, removes it from his body and buries it in the pot of basil. So they are reunited in a really odd and unusual and not a particularly romantic way, albeit, but they are reunited. So they do get a form of revenge on her cruel brothers. That is not what her brothers wanted. Her brothers wanted her married off to this wealthy man, the landowner who owns all the olive trees. They wanted her married with him. They wanted to strengthen their fortune. So the fact that Isabella continues to mourn and continues to love Lorenzo, and that she kind of withers away and she does not marry, is a kind of form of revenge, if you like. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And another thing to think about, that aside from any notion of revenge, this vision bidding Isabella adieu is setting Isabella off on a quest. And we talked yesterday about romance literature and the kind of genre associated with courtly love and knights and maidens, and the idea that the knight is set off on a challenge or a quest. Well, here we've got Lorenzo setting Isabella off on a challenge. He wants her to find his grave, he wants her to find his body, and to do that for him. And so there's a kind of inversion of that challenge and that quest from romance literature here, actually, where it's the maiden who is set off on the challenge. Okay, so what you need to do now is have a little bit of a think about these quotations further. So just in a moment when I finish speaking, pause the video and look back at your quotes and look back at the words that you've added in, and have a think about whether or not you can notice any patterns in those words that were missing. Okay, so if you just pause now and have a little think about that, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so I'm guessing you probably think I'm a bit obsessed with this by now, but many of these words you will have noticed, I'm sure you've noticed this, relate to sound and silence and vision. So you can see that Keats is continuing to use that kind of imagery, that sensory imagery in this part of the poem. But it also points us in the direction of Keats's use of the Gothic in this section. The use of the midnight setting, the silence, apart from the sounds of gloomy and apart from the sounds of groaning and suffering, and also reminding us about the injustice to Lorenzo, and the sense of horror and dread at his body, horribly mutilated and without proper burial. Yesterday we talked about that kind of Gothic idea of horror of things being done to the body, or the body being damaged and not being given the proper burial rites and things like that. And we've got all of these kinds of Gothic ideas are coming through these words that we've been thinking about there. Okay, I'm sure you've got some other connections as well that you can think about a bit further. Okay, moving on. So I think it would be useful at this point to just pause for a minute to have a look at some of the ways that Lorenzo's been described across the poem, because obviously we're now thinking about him as this ghostly figure, this vision. But if you look at how he was across the poem, you can see his kind of journey, and this movement from this devoted young man, the pilgrim, a young palmer in love's eye, this insistence that Keats had on him as a young figure, a vital figure, vibrant, full of life, until the two brothers had their sights on him. And then even when he was living, he was on borrowed time, and there was that inevitability about how his life was going to turn out. Okay, apologies for the typing error I murdered there. And he becomes this vision, the pale shadow. He exclaims, "I am a shadow." He's referred to as the spirit. sweet spirit, Isabella calls him. And he's also referred to as it. We had a quote earlier on that referred to him as it, which is interesting to think about. And then ultimately he's referred to as that jewel. So you can see his journey there from the young Palmer to a jewel. And that's really interesting, because when that description of him is used, it's referring to his head in the basil pot, which is so highly prized by Isabella, which is a rather grotesque image, isn't it? It's very incongruous, and sort of exaggerated, and it doesn't sit well with us. You might find it a little bit comic. But that idea that he's described as a jewel is something interesting to think about, how she prizes him, how she tends him with her tears at the end of the poem. Okay, so I think this leads us on nicely to Keats's own view of the poem. And as you can see, he wasn't particularly complimentary about it after he'd finished writing it. So just have a little look at some of the words he used to describe it in his letters. He said it was mawkish. So mawkish is an unusual word, not really very much in use now. It means overly sentimental or childishly emotional. It can kind of mean sickly as well, that kind of over the top, too much. He then went on to describe it as weak-sided, with an amusing, sober sadness in it. It seems like he felt it wasn't a poem to be taken seriously. That's what describing it as too smokable meant. He felt like people could laugh at it, which I think is something to think about, because I think we've talked before, or you may have read, that the original story of Isabella in the Decameron is very much about plot, and it's about events and one thing happening after another. And Keats didn't really want this poem to be like that. Keats wanted this poem to be one where he was delving into character and thinking about characterisation and thinking about the emotional presentation of character, rather than just focusing on plot. So it's interesting that he perhaps feels like he didn't do this in a satisfactory or a convincing way, and that he felt like he was, in doing so, kind of rendering it too simplistically, and thinking that it was too much open for people to laugh at or ridicule. Okay, and he kind of seems to feel like it's a bit of a naive poem with not much to it, perhaps. So you might want to think about what you've come across so far in your reading of the poem that potentially could be laughed at, that's potentially sort of overly sentimental. You might think about their love at the beginning. Is it too much? Is it a bit cloying? Is it too intense to be kind of perceived in any sort of realistic way, or as a representation of anything realistic? Is this idea of the head being severed from Lorenzo's body and placed in a basil pot, is that the kind of thing that he was thinking about as too smokable? Too easily laughed at? Surely he didn't think that people would take that seriously. I don't know. Okay, you have a think about that. Okay, so moving on, our next activity, which I'm hoping you can see clearly, is to put the plot in the correct order. There's a couple of reasons why we're going to do this. We're going to make sure that everyone's following the narrative of the poem and that we're all clear about what's happening. Hopefully I'll be able to do that now that I'm under pressure and being filmed. But I also want you to be thinking about anything you notice about patterns, about how Keats is telling the story and how he's building up tragedy. Okay, and you might want to just jot down as well any questions that are raised that we might be able to come back to later on. You can email them to me or your teacher and we can cover them in a future lesson, or you might answer them yourself later on as you go. Okay, so what you need to do now is pause the video and note down these stages in the plot. Okay, don't note down the number, because if I move one like that, the number of it changes. Okay, so note down the sentence, or note down a couple of keywords to remind you. Okay, so if you pause and do that now, go from 1 to 12, what order do these events go in the poem, and come back when you're ready and I'll talk us through it. Okay, so first one then, at the beginning of the poem, Isabella and Lorenzo fall in love, and then we have Isabella's brothers discover the secret romance and disapprove. The brothers plot to murder Lorenzo. Basil flourishes, that's going to be later on. That's later on. The brothers lure Lorenzo to a forest and kill and bury him there. And this one, Isabella is fearful and lonely, wondering why Lorenzo hasn't returned. Her brothers lie about his whereabouts. We talked about that earlier on. Lorenzo appears to Isabella in a dream and reveals his fate and where he's buried. Isabella, that should say I've missed an A. Isabella and her nurse go to the forest following Lorenzo's directions and dig up his body. They cut off his head and take it home with them. Isabella conceals the head in a basil pot and Basil grows over it. The basil flourishes as Isabella waters it with her tears. She's to be found by it constantly. The brothers, increasingly curious about what she's doing and what's in this pot, steal the pot and discover the head of Lorenzo. The brothers flee Florence, and Isabella, in her grief and madness, dies. Okay, so that's the full plot, and obviously this bit is what's coming for you next, because you might have read it once through already, but we've not studied it together yet, so that's where we're going to be going in our future lessons. Okay, so immediately you can see, when you've got the plot kind of spelled out for you in that sort of simple way like that, you can see the fall from happiness to suffering, to pity, to death, and to grief. So you can kind of start to map the tragic structure onto that. You can also see that there's three major stages to the poem. We've got their love, we've got the murder plot and the consequences of it, and then we've got the discovery of the body and the Basil plot part of the poem. Okay, so it's kind of quite easy to separate it out into those three sections. But of course, as I've been talking yesterday and today, you can see that when I'm talking about things that are happening here, I'm constantly saying, and that's an echo of what happened up here. So there's all of these little patterns and repetitions that are going on that you can, once we get to the end of it, you can go back through and sort of strand them out and map them out in some way that would really help you get your head around it. The other thing that you can see really is the elements of the tragic structure. So when it's written down really plainly, you can also see again there how ridiculous the Basil plot seems amidst all of this. But in terms of tragedy, we can see Isabella at the beginning, the high status woman, and we can see that she kind of, perhaps you could argue that she overreaches herself, that she's ambitious, that she overreaches herself in her desire to thwart her brother's plans and love a man who is considered to be low born. And we see her fall there, don't we? And we then see all of the suffering that follows from that, and we can, as an audience or as a reader, feel intense feelings of pity and fear for her. And then obviously we've got the further death at the end, as we would expect of a tragedy. And we'll need to have a think as we look at this next week about any kind of feelings of catharsis and resolution and any kind of relief there. The other thing that's interesting to think about when we lay the plot out like this is the interesting of the introduction of a new character. So you'll notice that in point 7 here, Isabella and her nurse go to the forest following Lorenzo's directions and dig up his body. So it's quite an interesting thing to do, to introduce a new character like this at such a late stage. So she acts in a similar role to the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. I accidentally quoted Romeo and Juliet before because it is on my mind because of the similarities with this poem, but she is like Juliet's nurse there, and she's also like the aged nurse in the Eve of St Agnes. So have a little bit of a think about that as you come to her in your reading over the next week. So she's an interesting addition, and we might wonder where her guidance has been up to this point. She's been entirely absent from the poem, but she's close enough to Isabella to accompany her into the forest on this really strange journey with this really sort of odd quest. You might wonder how on earth Isabella explained this to the nurse, but obviously the nurse is close to her, but she's been completely absent up until this point. She's not been any kind of guiding or protective figure or confidant in relation to Isabella's love for Lorenzo, and then Isabella's turmoil at Lorenzo's disappearance. So you might wonder why Keats has chosen to introduce her so far. Because she could earlier have been an interesting counterpoint to the cruelty of the brothers and another interesting female figure in the poem. So as you read the final section for next week, have a think about the role that she's playing and why Keats does bring her into the action of the play. And why she appears at this point, which is a particularly brutal and gothic moment of discovery of Lorenzo's body and the chopping off of his head. Why does he bring her in here? So it's really an interesting thing to think about. So your task between now and next week, because we're going to finish off here, is to read from stanza 41 to the end of the poem, really thinking about, one, why Keats includes the nurse and what you think about that. But also, what is your reaction to the discovery and dismembering of Lorenzo's body? Okay, so think about those two things as you're reading, and you might be thinking about some of these things, some of the things that perhaps connect with what Keats' own criticisms of the poem were. So do you, as you're reading Isabella's flight into the forest and or looking for all of the clues about where he's hidden and when she finds him, are you fearful for her? Are you shocked by what she finds and what she manages to summon up inside of her to do? Or is it, rather than shock, is it one of these more gothic feelings of horror? Or, was Keats right? Do you feel like you're going to laugh? Do you feel it is open to ridicule? It is too smokeable, it's incongruous, and it kind of doesn't fit there. Whatever you're feeling about it, have a think about whether or not that's the right feeling and why you might feel that way. Okay, I'm just going to remind you of what Keats said about it before I go. And you can have a think about whether or not you agree with him. Okay, so I hope that's been interesting and useful for you today. And I will be back next week to look together at the ending of the poem, and then to start to look at the poem as a whole and look at patterns and look at form and structure in a little bit more detail. Okay, thank you very much. Take care. Speak to you next time. Bye bye.